Picture this. You're walking along a New Jersey beach on a quiet morning when something catches your eye in the sand. Not shells or driftwood, but something that makes your blood run cold. Human bone fragments, bleached white by decades of salt water and sun. For nearly 30 years, these mysterious remains kept washing ashore, carrying with them a secret that would take cutting-edge science and determined students to finally solve. Welcome back to the channel. If you're fascinated by how modern technology can unlock mysteries from the distant past, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible cases. And stick around to the end. I want to hear your thoughts on this absolutely mind-blowing case in the comments. Starting in the mid-1990s, beachgoers and coastal patrol officers began finding something disturbing along New Jersey's coastline. Bone fragments, unmistakably human, would appear after storms, scattered across the sand like pieces of a puzzle that had been lost to time. The first discovery was made by a jogger in Brigantine, who initially thought they'd found driftwood until a closer look revealed the unmistakable curve of a human rib. Within hours, crime scene technicians were combing the beach, but what they found defied easy explanation. These weren't recent remains. The bones were heavily weathered, bleached white as coral, and showed clear signs of having been in salt water for an extended period. Marine growth had attached to some fragments, and the bone structure itself had the porous, worn appearance that comes from decades of exposure to salt water and sand abrasion. Each discovery prompted full investigations. Missing persons databases were searched, dental records compared, and forensic anthropologists consulted. But with no missing persons reports matching the timeline and no clear context, these fragments became one of New Jersey's most perplexing mysteries. Detective Maria Santos of the New Jersey State Police, who worked many of these cases, later recalled, "Every time we got called to a beach for bone fragments, part of us hoped this would be the time we'd get answers. But year after year, we just collected more pieces of the same puzzle with no picture to guide us." The New Jersey State Police collected each piece meticulously, cataloging location, date, and weather conditions. They hoped that someday science might provide answers. Little did they know they were gathering evidence from one of the oldest maritime disasters in American history. The man whose remains had been visiting New Jersey shores for decades was Henry Goodsell, a 29-year-old sea captain whose final voyage began in 1844. Goodsell wasn't just any sailor. He was the master of the schooner Oriental, a vessel that would meet its fate in the treacherous waters off Brigantine Shoal. Born in 1815, Henry Goodsell came from a maritime family. His father had worked the docks, and young Henry grew up understanding that the sea was both provider and predator. By his late 20s, he had earned the respect and trust necessary to command his own vessel. No small achievement in an era when ship captains held absolute authority over life and death decisions at sea. At 29, Goodsell was young for a captain, but the maritime world of the 1840s demanded experience over age. Ships like the Oriental were the lifelines of coastal commerce, carrying everything from lumber and grain to passengers seeking passage between ports along the eastern seaboard. These schooners were workhorses of American commerce, and their captains were skilled navigators who read wind, weather, and water like others read books. For Goodsell, commanding such a vessel represented both livelihood and responsibility. He held the lives of his crew and passengers in his hands every time they set sail. The weight of command was something every captain understood, but few discussed. In an age before radio communication or weather satellites, decisions made at sea were final, and help was often days away. The Oriental itself was a typical coastal schooner of its era, built for cargo capacity and speed, with 2 masts and the shallow draft necessary for entering smaller ports. These vessels were designed to hug the coastline, trading in protected waters whenever possible, but sometimes the demands of commerce required ventures into more dangerous waters. In 1844, maritime travel was both essential and perilous. The schooner Oriental, under Captain Henry Goodsell's command, departed on what should have been a standard coastal voyage. But as any sailor will tell you, the sea writes its own rules, and the waters off Brigantine Shoal were particularly unforgiving. Brigantine Shoal, located off the New Jersey coast, was a notorious hazard for 19th century mariners. These shallow, shifting sandbars could appear seemingly from nowhere, hidden just beneath the surface, ready to tear the hull from any vessel unfortunate enough to encounter them at the wrong tide or in poor visibility. Maritime records from 1844 show that the Oriental was carrying both cargo and passengers when it met its fate. The exact manifest has been lost to time, but similar vessels of that era typically carried between 6 to 12 souls, including crew and passengers. For families of that time, booking passage on a coastal schooner was often the most affordable way to travel between cities. The weather conditions on the day of the disaster remain unclear, but autumn storms along the New Jersey coast were notorious for their sudden onset and ferocity. Captains like Goodsell had to make split-second decisions based on changing wind patterns, visibility, and their knowledge of local waters. The exact circumstances of the Oriental's final moments remain lost to history, but the outcome was tragically clear. The schooner foundered on Brigantine Shoal, taking Captain Goodsell and possibly others to their watery grave. In 1844, such disasters were recorded in shipping logs and newspapers, but with limited resources for recovery, victims often remained with their vessels on the ocean floor. Contemporary newspaper accounts from the period mention the loss of the Oriental, but provide few details about recovery efforts or the fate of those aboard. This was typical for the era. Maritime disasters were common enough that unless they involved prominent passengers or exceptional circumstances, they received only brief mention in local papers. For 150 years, the story of Henry Goodsell and the Oriental remained buried in maritime archives, just another tragic footnote in the dangerous history of coastal shipping. Meanwhile, the Atlantic continued its slow work of erosion and current, gradually breaking apart the wreck and its contents. The first bone fragment appeared on a New Jersey beach sometime in the mid-1990s. Then another, and another. Over nearly 3 decades, these mysterious remains would surface after major storms, each piece adding to a collection that frustrated investigators and forensic experts alike. What made these discoveries particularly puzzling was their pattern. The bones didn't appear randomly. They seemed to wash ashore primarily after significant storm events, when heavy seas and strong currents stirred up the ocean floor. Beach patrol officers began to recognize the pattern, and some even started checking specific stretches of coastline after major weather events. The New Jersey State Police treated each discovery seriously, following standard protocols for unidentified remains. Crime scene photographers documented each find. Forensic anthropologists examined the bones for signs of trauma or identifying characteristics, and investigators searched missing persons databases going back decades. But without context, no missing persons reports, no witnesses, no associated evidence like clothing or personal effects, the bones remained an enigma. Traditional forensic methods could tell investigators the remains were human, likely male, appeared to be from an adult, and had been in saltwater for an extended period. But that was where the trail went cold. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Sarah Chen, who examined many of the fragments over the years, later noted, "These bones told a story, but it was written in a language we couldn't yet read. The level of degradation suggested extreme age, but we had no framework for understanding just how old they might be." DNA testing in the 1990s and early 2000s wasn't advanced enough to extract useful genetic information from such degraded samples. The bones had been subjected to decades of salt water, sun, and sand, conditions that destroy most genetic material. For years, they sat in evidence storage, waiting for science to catch up to the mystery. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: students. In 2023, the Ramapo College Investigative Genetic Genealogy Center became involved in the case. This wasn't your typical college research project. These students were working with cutting-edge forensic techniques that have revolutionized cold case investigations. The Ramapo College program, led by experienced forensic genealogists and geneticists, had already made a name for itself in the forensic community. Students in the program work on real cases under expert supervision, combining academic learning with practical application that can bring closure to families and law enforcement agencies. Investigative genetic genealogy combines traditional forensic DNA analysis with genealogical research, using public databases and family trees to identify individuals from even degraded genetic samples. It's the same technology that caught the Golden State Killer and has solved hundreds of other cold cases across the country. Graduate student Rebecca Martinez was among the team members who took on the Goodsell case. "When we first saw these bone fragments," she later recalled, "we knew we were dealing with something unusual. The degradation was unlike anything we'd worked with before, but our professor encouraged us to see it as a challenge rather than an obstacle." The students, working under expert supervision, faced a significant challenge. The bone fragments were severely degraded, having spent decades in one of the most hostile environments possible for DNA preservation. Salt water, temperature fluctuations, UV exposure, and physical abrasion from sand and rocks had all taken their toll on any genetic material that might remain. But advances in DNA extraction and analysis techniques meant that even tiny amounts of genetic material could potentially yield results. New methods for extracting DNA from degraded bone samples had been developed specifically for ancient DNA research and forensic applications. The team began the painstaking process of attempting to extract usable DNA from the most promising bone fragments. They selected pieces that showed the best preservation potential, typically dense bone sections that might have protected genetic material from environmental degradation. When the DNA analysis finally yielded results, the team had achieved what many thought impossible. They had extracted usable genetic material from bones that had been in saltwater for nearly 2 centuries. But having DNA was only the beginning of their detective work. The genetic profile they obtained was partial and degraded, but it contained enough markers to begin the identification process. However, they faced a unique challenge. They had genetic markers, but no name, no family, no starting point except the knowledge that these remains were much older than anyone had initially suspected. The team's approach involved building what geneticists call a reverse family tree. Using genetic genealogy databases like GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, they began comparing their unknown individuals' DNA profile to profiles submitted by people researching their own family histories. Dr. James Patterson, the professor overseeing the research, explained the process. Traditional genealogy works forward from ancestors to descendants. What we do is work backwards from genetic matches to find common ancestors, then forward again to identify our unknown individual. The process revealed several distant genetic matches, people who shared enough DNA with their mystery individual to indicate common ancestors, but who lived generations apart. These matches became breadcrumbs leading back through time. Student researcher Michael Chen spent months building family trees for each genetic match, looking for patterns and intersections that might point to their unknown individual's identity. The work required not just scientific knowledge, but historical research skills and patience. The breakthrough came when they identified multiple genetic matches who all traced their ancestry back to the same region of New Jersey in the early 1800s. This geographic clustering suggested their unknown individual had roots in the same area. As they dug deeper into maritime records, passenger manifests, and ship logs from the 1840s, one name began appearing repeatedly in connection with vessels operating out of New Jersey ports: Henry Goodsell. When they found records indicating Goodsell had been the captain of the schooner Oriental, which had been lost off Brigantine Shoal in 1844, the pieces began falling into place. The identification of Henry Goodsell was promising, but scientific standards require confirmation. In forensic genetics, a hypothesis based on genealogical research must be verified through direct DNA comparison. In 2025, the team obtained a crucial piece of evidence: a DNA sample from a living descendant of Henry Goodsell. Finding this descendant was a story in itself. The research team had to trace Goodsell's family line forward through time, following marriages, births, and migrations across nearly 2 centuries. They eventually identified Thomas Goodsell, a retired teacher living in Pennsylvania, who was Henry's great-great-great-grandson. When researchers first contacted Thomas, he was skeptical. "I thought it was some kind of scam," he later admitted. "Someone calling to tell me my ancestors' bones had been washing up on beaches for 30 years? It sounded like something out of a movie." But when the scientific team explained their methodology and the significance of the case, Thomas agreed to provide a DNA sample. The comparison would provide the definitive proof needed to close the case. The analysis took several weeks, as the team worked to compare Thomas's complete genetic profile with the partial, degraded DNA they had extracted from the bone fragments. Despite the challenges posed by the old, damaged genetic material, the comparison was clear and conclusive. When the results came back, they were unambiguous. The bone fragments that had been washing up on New Jersey beaches for nearly 30 years belonged to Captain Henry Goodsell, the 29-year-old master of the schooner Oriental who had perished in 1844. The moment of confirmation was emotional for everyone involved. Rebecca Martinez, the graduate student who had worked on the case, described the experience. We'd spent months with these anonymous bone fragments, and suddenly they had a name, a story, a life. Henry Goodsell wasn't just a maritime casualty anymore. He was a real person who had been waiting 180 years to be identified. The confirmation represented more than just solving a mystery. It marked one of the oldest cold cases ever resolved through genetic genealogy. The technology that had identified victims from recent disasters and caught modern criminals had reached back nearly 2 centuries to give a name to remains that had wandered the Atlantic for 180 years. The Goodsell case demonstrates the incredible potential of genetic genealogy to solve historical mysteries. Traditional forensic methods had hit a dead end decades ago, but advances in DNA technology opened new possibilities for identification that seemed like science fiction just a generation ago. For the New Jersey State Police, the case represented the successful conclusion of one of their longest-running mysteries. Detective Santos, who had collected many of the bone fragments over the years, was present when the identification was announced. After all those years of wondering, all those families we couldn't notify, all those questions without answers, finally, we could give this man his name back. For the students at Ramapo College, the case was validation of their innovative approach to forensic investigation. The success opened doors to additional cold cases and demonstrated that academic institutions could make significant contributions to law enforcement efforts. The case also pushed the boundaries of what forensic science considered possible. The successful extraction and analysis of DNA from bones that had been submerged in saltwater for 180 years represented a new benchmark for ancient DNA analysis. The techniques developed for this case are now being applied to other historical mysteries and archaeological investigations. Most remarkably, the identification gives dignity to a man who had been lost to history. Henry Goodsell wasn't just another maritime casualty. He was a person with a name, a profession, a family, and presumably people who mourned his loss 180 years ago. The identification connects us across centuries, reminding us that every mystery has a human story at its center. The case has also influenced how law enforcement agencies approach long-term evidence storage. The New Jersey State Police had preserved every bone fragment for nearly 30 years, never knowing when technology might catch up to provide answers. Their diligence was ultimately rewarded, but it raises questions about how many other unsolved cases might benefit from similar patience and preservation efforts. The story of Henry Goodsell reminds us that the ocean keeps its secrets for a long time, but not forever. Modern science has given us tools that would seem like magic to investigators even a few decades ago, let alone to the people of 1844 who lost Captain Goodsell to the sea. This case also raises fascinating questions about how many other historical mysteries might be solvable with today's technology. How many unidentified remains in evidence storage around the country might have names and stories waiting to be discovered? How many cold cases from decades past might yield to genetic genealogy techniques? For Thomas Goodsell, the descendant who provided the confirming DNA sample, the experience was both surreal and meaningful. Learning that my great-great-great-grandfather's remains had been literally washing ashore for decades, carrying a message from the past that only modern science could finally decode. It's humbling, he reflected. It makes you think about how connected we all are across time. The identification has also prompted new interest in the maritime history of the New Jersey coast. Local historians are now researching other shipwrecks from the same era, wondering if genetic genealogy might help identify other victims of maritime disasters. The Oriental was just one of many vessels lost in these waters during the 19th century. Perhaps most significantly, the case demonstrates the power of persistence in both scientific investigation and evidence preservation. The New Jersey State Police could have discarded those bone fragments years ago as unsolvable, but their commitment to preserving evidence paid off in ways they could never have anticipated. The Ramapo College team's work shows how academic institutions can contribute meaningfully to law enforcement efforts. The combination of student enthusiasm, expert supervision, and cutting-edge technology created a perfect storm for solving what many considered an impossible case. The Henry Goodsell case stands as a testament to human ingenuity, persistence, and the power of technology to bridge the gap between past and present. It's a reminder that no case is truly cold if the evidence survives and the will to solve it remains strong. So what do you think about this incredible case? Can you imagine learning that your ancestors' remains had been washing up on beaches for 30 years before science could finally identify them? The intersection of cutting-edge genetics and 19th century maritime history creates one of the most fascinating cold case resolutions we've ever seen. This case also makes me wonder, what other mysteries from the past are waiting for the right technology to unlock them? How many evidence rooms across the country contain fragments of stories that future science might be able to complete? The dedication of those New Jersey State Police officers who collected and preserved every bone fragment for 3 decades, never knowing if they'd ever get answers, is truly remarkable. Their patience and professionalism literally made this identification possible. And the work of those Ramapo College students reminds us that breakthrough discoveries can come from unexpected places. Sometimes it takes fresh eyes and new techniques to solve puzzles that have stumped investigators for years. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I genuinely love hearing your perspectives on these fascinating cases where science meets history. Have you ever wondered about your own family's maritime history? Do you think there are other historical mysteries that genetic genealogy might be able to solve? And if you enjoyed this deep dive into forensic history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true crime stories where cutting-edge science meets centuries-old mysteries. Next week, we'll be exploring another case where modern technology reached back through time to solve what seemed like an impossible puzzle. Until then, stay curious, and remember, sometimes the most amazing discoveries are literally washing up on our shores, waiting for the right moment and the right science to reveal their secrets.